Hello, Catholic YouTube. Good morning, everyone. Brian with City of the Immaculata back with you. I wanted to let you guys know, for those of you watching live or to catch this in the next couple of days, I have a great interview coming up with a good friend of mine, Mariana Dean, and it's going to be about the life and philosophy of Olavo de Carvalho, and he is not a well-known name here in the United States, but he's a very well-known name in Brazil. So keep an eye out for that one. I had a really good conversation with her that's going to go out on Wednesday. As for today, I have been thinking about this one for the last several weeks, actually, at this point now, and how I wanted to go about this particular talk. And it's kind of a funny thing. You set out on a journey in life, and you have these specific goals in mind, and along the way, things, opportunities, inconveniences sort of present themselves to you. In a sense, the ventures at time pick you rather than you picking them. And I never set out to be a channel that was, at least in part, known for its defense of, let's say, non-Anglophone cultures. I did my presentation almost a year ago at this point on Lakota Catholics, and I'm proud of it. I think it's something that's not well known. It's certainly not discussed, and I wish. I think at this point it was a 5-part series, and I think I've got up to almost maybe 500 views on the first video. Most of them didn't hit the 400 mark. So I wish it had gotten more traction, but such is life. The one area that did get some traction, unsurprisingly, turns out to be controversy, which, go figure, is kind of the thing that I generally try to avoid. But, for years, you guys wouldn't necessarily know this, but for years I was involved in politics and debate, and I was so elated to put all of that to rest when I converted to Catholicism. Like, I just wanted to be like Mel Gibson in The Patriot on my little Catholic farm called City of the Immaculata, doing my little tiny videos without the stress of controversy. And then, I make a little YouTube short or a tweet gets picked up. And, well, as far as that goes, what happened that sort of propelled me to start, I think, focusing on this a little bit more sincerely is I clipped a short that mentioned a certain Texan cowboy over some controversies around what's happening in the Amazon. And two of his friends, all of these people with largely disproportionate followers compared to what I have here, picked this up and sent it out, and their audience kind of came after me. I mean, the comments that I got relating to this ranged from, comments on my looks to my being a liberal of all things to, my orthodoxy being questioned, of course. Later, more recently, I came to the defense of a group of Chippewa natives in Wisconsin, I believe, who were doing an authorized devotion before a mass. And again, out come the wolves, same group of people, same accusations. so the world turns, you know, and I begin to think that maybe there is a real need here. One that I could, in theory, lend my tiny little voice to in whatever small way that I can, because it always seems to be the same people, always and always with the same ill-informed responses. And to be fair here, this comes from either side of the spectrum because, you know, on one side of the spectrum, we have liberals telling us that we're imperialist monsters and that all cultures are equal in all ways, even when they diametrically oppose one another. Then on the other side, we have the so-called traditionalists who want to lump anyone, and I mean anyone, who comes to the defense of a culture that happens to not be European, wants to lump them in with the liberals. One guy, and you guys would know who I'm talking about probably if I mentioned his name, he was insistent that I was a liberal. And I tried to say, hey man, like, you know, despite the fact that you kind of blasted me on Twitter, like, why don't you reach out to me in private? My DMs are open and let's talk. And you'll find, you know, that I've a little more nuance to these things than what you're kind of claiming here. But it's like, nope, you're a liberal, dude. So again, I see the need to have this conversation, to attempt to have it. And I'm going to take, I think, a few different approaches to this. I really want to shore it up with the historical record. I think that's kind of the thing where when we look at how Christianity, when it arrives in Europe, and how it so absorbed pagan Europe, that most of these so-called traditionalists, I don't even think they realize just how thoroughly like melded this process was. And this will easily, you know, thinking about the like depth, the sheer like, I mean, we're talking 2,000 years of history at this point. This could easily and probably will turn into several installments. So we'll see what I can get through today. But I think ultimately, at the base level, the question boils down to is the title of this video. What does inculturation, specifically Catholic inculturation, look like? And this is where I think all of the differences arrive from. And I will say, to give our separated brethren a fair deal here, I will say I think the Protestants are fairly consistent with this, more so than the so-called traditionalists on the Catholic side. I don't even think that the guys on uh, X, formerly known as Twitter, I don't think that they realized, as they were kind of coming down hard on me on this, that they were aware of the fact, at least the irony of the fact, that they were on the side of a schismatic Anglican priest that I was trying to politely point out to this Anglican the history behind the ceremony that was taking place on this chrism mass in Wisconsin, and then the Catholics were siding with him. So the irony was kind of missed on that, but it is a real problem. And I will give the Anglican here that I think that he is at least consistent to the Protestant tradition, because the Protestants come along in the 16th century and they say, hey, we've been doing this wrong all along. And they ultimately landed on sort of a few sides. There's no like one Protestant way that they looked at this, but I kind of want to look at what happened and what people are saying is the result of that. So to broaden the scope a little bit, because as we will show, it is undeniable that Catholic Europe had many, many instances of absorbing pagan culture and ritual into the faith. So I want us, I want us all to see that at a foundational level, depending on how you view reality and history, what is happening here. And this will all make sense as I go through it, I believe. So first, if we were to consider history from a mechanistic materialist vantage point, that and I mean this broadly speaking, right, that the events of history are but like mere chance, and that there is no real like providential component to speak of, even in the fact that some may be deterministic in a very philosophical sense. Leaving all of that aside, ultimately they would say, as it on a pragmatic level for human beings, that history is mere chance. So if this were the case, then what you would have is in the year roughly 33 AD, you have this new cult, which was going to come to be known as Christianity, spreading out, leaving the Levant, migrating across the Roman world. And as it does, it sort of naturally picks up practices from those cultures that it's bumping up against, as well as it's converting people and bringing these people, these new pagan people, into the faith. They bring in some of these people's practices with them. So, in this real, like, kind of haphazard view of history, it makes sense that Christians, as they're just small minority, a new cult coming out of the Levant, would have been unable to control and suppress all of the things which, according to later reformers, is antithetical to the tenets of this cult. Now, as Christianity in the mechanistic materialist view fortuitously gains traction and it brings society under heel, eventually there was enough people at some random place and time who were able to say, hey, this evolution of pagan Europe into Christian Europe was never properly purged. And now here we are, said the reformers. So basically, in this atheist worldview, if you call it that, it's all chance. And logically, you have a new, weak, growing Christianity, which would never have been able to properly expunge paganism before paganism saturated Christianity. And by the time that Christianity had become the dominant religion with society under it in the High Middle Ages, it had become paganism had already at that point completely saturated to the point that they didn't even realize, right, that they had these pagan these elements of paganism which continued in through the centuries. So the Protestant position isn't that much different depending on who you ask, except that they place it in the providential realm. Some Protestants would say that the church actually defected from the beginning. And these folks realized that they recognize that paganism's influence crept in from the very start, and they attribute this to a general apostasy. Now, I find this, while historically it's the least tenable, consistently in terms of logic, it's the most consistent given what actually happens with Christianity from the very beginning. Now, this is not the frequent view of the early reformers. Let me be clear, right? This would be more in terms of like break off groups like the Latter Day Saints or the Jehovah's Witnesses, right? These groups that claim that there was a very early apostasy because they look back into the historical record and they say, look, there's a lot of paganism very early on. Whereas the second group, which is more consistent with the view of the early reformers, says that paganism creeps in over time and muddies the early church's more pristine and purer form. Until at some time, the reformers would say that paganism had effectively become so normalized by the High Middle Ages that it's like barnacles on a boat that need to be scraped off. Now there are plenty of examples. You could just read. Bellarmine has a great treatment of it in his On the Roman Pontiff, where he talks about the inconsistency of the historical record because the Protestants were not in agreement with when exactly the Roman Church defected from the ancient faith. There's all kinds of like arguments about that, even though the consistent argument among the Protestants was that the papacy defects at a certain point and becomes the office of Antichrist. They don't actually have any agreement whatsoever among themselves when that actually happened. And I would actually argue that even though this is the more predominant view of at least the early Reformation, historically it doesn't actually hold up very well. Because we're going to explore, here in a little bit, that the more common accepted view, at least from a historical record, is that these Christians were bumping up against pagans. They were bringing pagans into the faith, and there's a whole lot more melding that takes place than these people are granting. But this is a common view. It's among both the Protestants, and we find it, as I'm learning, We're finding it among the so-called traditionalist Catholics as well. But I'm going to make the case that this is the less viable and least consistent of all the views. Finally, after all of those, you have what is, I think, the truly Catholic position on this, the one that has been sort of worked out through the centuries, where Christianity comes in and it moves in right alongside to these existent pagan cultures. And ultimately, I know it's sort of a colloquial way of referring to it. Ultimately, what happens is that Christian society, Christian culture becomes the predominant mainstay of society and ultimately baptizes, keeping the good things of that society while ridding out the evil elements. And this has taken many forms over many different people over many centuries, but I do believe that we have enough under our belt at this time to have a good idea of how it works. The Celts, the Celtic people, for example, for various reasons, specifically on the Gaelic shores of Ireland, for both internal and external reasons. The external reasons that eventually, over time, the Norman invaders would conform the Irish island to the Roman norms. But for centuries, for many centuries, the Celtic Christianity had been fine on its own, and it would have been perfectly fine to continue had the Celtic people not, through various reasons, like the Norman invaders, and for their own internal reasons at times, eventually adopted the Roman practices. But even at, like, say, the Synod of Whitby, where the basically there was kind of decided that we were going to bring the Celtic tradition under the Roman calendar specifically. Even there, some of the holy saints at that synod said that, look, men like Saint Columba and these others were perfectly fine in their traditional Celtic ways. And had Columba, say for example, had Columba been here for this holy synod, he would have agreed to changing to the Roman norms. Because the argument for changing to the Roman norms weren't so much that the Celts were inherently wrong for what they were doing, but there was some complex issues about having these two different dates for Easter that they were trying to challenge. But again, the saints at the Synod of Whitby confirmed St. Columba's holiness as a Celt. And one thing I want to lay aside right from the beginning here is what I'll refer to speak Zoomer language as the cringe factor. Because in my back and forths with this online, the most common accusation that I see was that for example, I'm gonna probably stick mostly to the example of the ceremony that took place in Wisconsin with the Chippewa tribe, was that the man and the women involved in that ceremony before the Chrism Mass were actively engaging in pagan ritual, i.e., they were summoning the demonic or they were worshiping false gods, take your pick, whatever it is. And once I demonstrated that that was objectively not true, the next most common accusation that I saw was that, well, it just looks bad. It's bad optics. And I will say, depending on your vantage point, a thing may very well look bad. For example, let's say you're a Greek. Let's say you're a Greek in the year, I don't know, 950. And in your culture, the men who shave are effeminate men. They tend to be less than the most manly type. Let's just put it as politically correct as we can. So when you see a man shaved, that signifies to you as a Greek that you're looking at an effeminate men who are given to certain proclivities of a carnal type. Then you go to, I don't know, Rome, for example, and you see that all of the Roman priests are shaved. And this looks bad to you. In fact, it looks so bad that in the Byzantine lists, the shaved priest is one of the most common tropes brought against Latin Christians. Not to mention the enzymes and the fact that the Latins used unleavened bread, which again looked bad to the Greeks per their own custom, To you as a Greek, it looked like the Latins were denying the resurrection of Jesus Christ when they used unleavened bread. But there's very specific reasons that the Latins were using unleavened bread. Now, the Latins did, in fact, now, okay, it's a historically arguable point of whether or not the Latins always used unleavened bread or not. But the Latins did at a certain point start shaving, and they did at a certain point, I believe, I don't think it was, I think the earliest practice was that the early church probably used leavened bread and the Latins changed it over time. But the Latins actually, after the fact, has like kind of retroactively added some theological opinions. Now, I know there's different people that are going to argue about that fact, but regardless, it looks bad to the Greeks. But is this like what is really going on here, right? Were the Latins denying the resurrection? Or are you, as a Greek, taking what looks bad to you and applying it to other people to whom it may not be so bad? And who was the official arbitrator of all of this, of whether or not something is proper or, even just aesthetically proper? So do you kind of see the problem here with this? Now, one challenge that I haven't heard brought up by any of the critics that I actually think is kind of a fair point that could be made were people more knowledgeable about a specific culture that they want to critique. And I'm going to use the American Indians as the example here because it's kind of fresh in people's minds per what happened a few weeks ago. And I think it illustrates the challenges well. One of the things about Native American customs is that many of their practices, their customs were forcibly driven out, specifically by government regulations. The US policy, the US government's policy it was unofficially to kill the Indian, save the man. So, for example, in boarding schools, when a young child would enter the boarding school, all semblance of their traditional ways of life were wiped out almost immediately. You see these quite stark, drastic pictures of a child when they entered versus like a few days later, what they looked like. Now, at the time, and this is where it gets very, very complex. At the time, the Jesuits were active in some of these schools. The ones like, for example, that I'm most familiar with on the um, Pine Ridge reservations, helping the Sioux and specifically the Lakota out. And the Jesuits were constantly stuck in this situation where they had to walk a tightrope of what they wanted to do versus what they were allowed to do per the US government's agreement. Because the agreement was that in order for the Jesuits to remain on these reservations and for their efforts to be subsidized by the US government, which made the situation tenable and possible, you had to comply to these government protocols of, for example, like you weren't allowed to speak the Lakota language in the schools. In fact, the Lakota language was like kind of the intention was to beat the language out of the children. So it's kind of a deal with the devil. So you get American Indians of that generation where due to the like kind of and this is not like I'm not like blaming the Jesuits or the nuns or even any of the Protestant teachers of that time. I mean, like that kind of like the strict punishment was the standard. My great grandfather uh, built a school and he was the principal of that school. And my grandfather tells me he had memories of his father walking around. He was a disciplinarian man. He walked around with the paddle, and to like hit a child in those days, it was not uncommon as a disciplinary measure. So I'm not like blaming these people when I say like that it was kind of like beating out of the children. It was just the way that things were at that time. But it was like these young children, and that it's kind of an effective thing because the young children that went into these schools, if the old way of life was beaten out of you, you tended to not continue doing the old way of life, or you ran away from the boarding school, which was quite common, especially for the young boys. So the Catholic missionary groups on these reservations believe that this was all due to the the Catholic Indians specifically believe that this was all due to the Catholic Church's approval of these policies. And that's a tricky thing because, as we stated, I don't think that the Jesuits, there were things that the Jesuits wanted to do versus what they were able to do. Because you get for example, right? Like you have Jesuit priests. So it's demanded, right, of the Jesuits that these kids speak English. But there's many kids that tell the story that after they're adults, they grew up, that says that there were Jesuits, even at the Holy Rosary Monastery, that, this was the case, that there was a certain priest, I forget his name, Father, oh gosh, I can't think of it right now. But anyways, he's responsible for helping actually the children preserve the Lakota language, because what he would have them do is at recess, he would have the kids like surround him and speak Lakota to him, where he sort of worked out a way of transcribing the language phonetically because he wanted to see the language preserved. So there's a little bit of like cognitive dissonance, I think, involved in all of this, where you have the older generation, it's kind of like driven out of them and beaten out of them. And then you get later, as these sort of policies eased, you get the 60s and 70s, and you get the grandchildren of the first generation boarding school folk. These grandchildren are in the 60s and 70s kind of come along, and they want to re-identify with their roots, right? They want to harken back to a way of life that was before things in their minds got really bad. And what they did is a lot of them kind of cobbled together sort of a hodgepodge of old customs. And even in many cases, Catholic Indians were caught up in all of this. And I don't blame them. I mean, honestly, stripping them of their culture was never like Catholic policy. And the fact that one or two generations in, they want to reclaim some of that, I think that's noble. It's a noble enough endeavor. Certainly understandable. I mean, this is what the Anglophone traditionalists say that they want for themselves, right? Many of these Anglophones weren't like, there's at least a single generation, if not two, three generations gap at this point between the traditions that these Anglophones say that they want to recover. Well, this is what these young American Indians in the 60s and 70s say that they wanted as well. Of course, there's always problems with that, because now I'm gonna try to stick here, I think, to the complexities of evangelization, because reclaiming a past culture is a very tricky thing. And the situation with the American Indians here in the United States and Canada stands as kind of a stark realization for many of just how complex these things become. So, one, consider the fact that early on, the pressures by the US government's enforcement of certain blood laws turned the situation from less to do about tribal affiliation to one to do more about race. So early on in the conflict between the government and the American Indians, it was there. It's certainly there by the time of the Pan Indian movements of the 60s and 70s. Many of these people present themselves as being a movement of skin color. And early on, there is resentment early on in the sort of wars that are taking place, both the actual wars and the political wars that are taking place between white settlers and the American Indians themselves. There's always like intermingling going on, right? Where you have children being born, and the fair skinned children of these intermixed couples experience resentment and persecution from both sides. Oftentimes, the governments of both the United States and Canada delegated policies that were to be enforced to the mixed children, creating even more of an environment of hostility towards these people within the reservation tribe. So even today, when I saw the comments, for example, first it was, oh, well, these women are pagan witches. And then to obfuscate the point, it becomes, well, the women actually looked white. And look, race, certainly here in the United States, race complicates things. The main question, though, per the standard, if we want to keep the US government standard as the model, which it historically has been, it's what both sides are arguing about. They're using the US government's standard as the model, is what blood percentage did you have of white blood to be allowed to be admitted into white society, and what percentage to be excluded? A government bureaucrat in the 1890s wasn't so concerned with whether you could physically pass as a white or not, though in practical terms, that actually did quite help if you were able to pass. They looked at who your parents were and who your grandparents were on paper. And some of these, white tribal people stayed on the tribes because their parents and their grandparents never attempted to assimilate into white society. Now, of course, you did have some that went on to pass into white society, and then later their children want to claim American Indian blood. So there is that as well. So the US situation is absolutely made more difficult by the issue of race. And both sides have enough blame to go around on that. I'm talking left, right, white, American Indian. Now, the second thing to consider is that Catholics were a part of Catholic Indians specifically were a part of reclaiming Indian identity. And many of the children of the 60s and 70s began incorporating various elements and customs that harken back to their traditional ways of life. And much like the traditionalists themselves say they want to do, to return to some of the customs that they feel robbed of. But right away, there was some pushback. It was what's appropriate, what isn't appropriate. And an interesting thing is I've heard, I can't remember her name. Her talk is on YouTube. I'll see if I can link it in the description. She's a Lakota woman, an elder, and she was talking about when she was coming up in the 60s and 70s, and she was a part of this revival of interest in Indian traditions and customs. She said the biggest pushback that she got was from her grandparents, the ones who were in the boarding schools where these things were beaten out of them. Now, she says, look, we don't blame the grandparents. This is what they were raised to believe. They were fearful that, if they allowed some of these things to come back, that there was going to be a retributive blowback from white society against them again. You don't want to go through all of that, kids. You don't know how bad that was. So she says, look, we don't blame them, but there was, and I go through this in great detail in the series that I did on Lakota Catholicism, even before the boarding schools really became an issue, there was Jesuits doing the work within Lakota culture to enculturate certain practices of the traditional Indian way of life into a Catholic context and a Catholic framework. So there is absolutely like 100% a precedent for this, right? And I want to just share with you guys, I'm not going to go too deep into this. Let me see here. I'm going to present, share screen, share window, enculturation, no. Hold on, I'm always trying to fight technology, so you guys just have to bear with me. Okay, let's try this again. Let's see, how is that? Great. So this document here, recommendations for the enculturation of Lakota Catholicism. I really recommend, it's put up by the Rapid City Diocese. I recommend, just if you're interested in this stuff, it's released 1999. Go spend some time with this document. It's not a very long document, and it just goes through some of this is the hierarchy now. The hierarchy of Rapid City Diocese is looking at these practices that people want to return to and saying, okay, what can we allow here? What should we not allow here? And they have some really great stuff on the liturgy of the Eucharist, some interesting things with funeral rites and marriage rites and baptism. And it's just well worth spending some time with this document. And I didn't like actually mark places. I've read the document several times, but there's just some great spots in here. Like, for example, the idea that you want to have the people themselves very much involved in leadership roles to help sort of foster the Lakota, um, the church's life within this process of catechetical and liturgical norms becoming normative, anyways. So using the Lakota language where it's appropriate to use Lakota language in the mass, um, some of the specific rituals that would be appropriate for the for the Lakota people, where to do that in the liturgy, some of the hymns and the allowable like traditional Lakota music. And I want to just be clear because there's so many people who want to like they will hear a chant, and I'm not even going to attempt to like chant in the Lakota style because it's not, it would be very culturally inappropriate of me. But I couldn't do it anyways. But when you hear it and you hear that style of chanting, well, for one, I don't believe that the Chippewa man who was chanting um at the pulpit in the video, I don't think he's actually even saying words. I think he was just doing a traditional. It's just like a vocal pitch. It's a pitch chant. There's not even words that are happening there. He's beating the drum and he's like he's fluctuating his pitch and it, so it's not actually even using words. But when they do use words, some, and I very seriously doubt many of the critics of this stuff are going to be watching my video here, but if you do, just be careful, because figure out what the people are saying before you come along and say that they're saying something demonic, because they could very well be saying, Jesus, I love you. Right? So just make sure that they're not saying something that you um would not want to have to answer for one day, for telling people, calumny is a sin, right? And I know people throw that word around sometimes um, nonchalantly, but if these people are chanting Jesus, I love you, and you're telling other people that they're chanting something demonic, like you, I think are going to have to be answerable for that one day. Let's see. Incensing, very important to all of us. Those of us in Western cultures, they did not have the type of incense that we have. So, of course, they're saying here it's appropriate in their context to use sweetgrass, sage, or cedar. So on through, right? And you can, I would really, again, just take the time to read this. That you can see the diocese is very careful with a lot of this stuff. I'll give you another example where, all right, this is at funeral rites, the keeping of the spirit and the release of the spirit. Okay, so listen to this. This is where I can show you that they're not just a blanket embracement of all of these things. The keeping of the spirit is pre-Christian. It developed as a way to spread the mourning process out over time and to honor specific people in a unique way. In ancient times, when someone died, the relatives hurt very deeply, and they would cut themselves on their chest and arms. And you can hear, I mean, read the George Caitlin accounts. He talks about like just how like just harrowing it is to watch. Like the women will just start cutting themselves when someone dies. Some would cut off fingers, and they did this in order to objectify the internal hurt they felt. But the community came to understand that this was too extreme. Now, they don't say it here, but the reason that they came to understand is because they were introduced to certain Christian norms. The community developed a ceremony to keep the spirit of the deceased among the living so that the family members could grieve over time. The belief was that the soul left through the hair of the deceased, so by cutting off a piece of the hair, the deceased remained present among the living soul until it was released a year later. While the hair was present, the person was still living among them. Now, this ceremony testified to the belief in the life after death. The Christian understanding of the communion of saints makes it clear that all of us have a life beyond this one. Moreover, our deceased relatives and friends do remain with us and care about us. The death and resurrection of Jesus testifies that we will live with him forever. The Lakota Christians who commit to keeping of the spirit ceremony are testifying to the fact that there is life beyond the grave. And they are also honoring their relatives by entering into a suitable period of mourning. People who have suffered a great loss can be tempted to run away from the pain by doing things that will distract them. During this vulnerable time, people can develop habits that are not healthy. Those families who decide to do the keeping of the spirit are asked to abstain from dancing at powwows and other enjoyable community activities in order to recollect themselves and to honor their relatives. This is the cult. This is a norm for them, right? Like if you had lost your father or your mother or your child or brother or whatever, you would not be dancing at a powwow or enjoying other activities. You would enter into a period of mourning. So this keeping of the spirit ceremony is a way to, the church is saying here, to kind of keep with that tradition of um, observing remembrance of the dead, but doing it in a, with the context of, Christ and the resurrection. And we're going to have to like pick up at some other point just the significance of um, taking pre-Christian symbols and meaning and applying it to Christian. Um, I'm sorry, I'm looking for something specific here, but applying it to the Christian theology. Now, it says that the task force, funerals and wakes, where is it at? Okay, I think right here. Yeah, the task force will investigate the following ceremonies in the relationship to the liturgies of the sacraments and the worship of the church. So this was finished in 1999, and they basically said, look, we still have several other things that we need to take a look at. I have heard from several Lakota specifically that they want this document revisited so that it for all appearances does need to be updated. And then the other thing is like, um, how do we express to other people, right? To the this looks bad people. Do we make them all sit down and read this document? This is why I think this is such an important conversation to have. And the document's very clear as well that some random group of people, like in my parish, that want to start praying to the four directions have no business doing that. It isn't appropriate to our culture and our ancestors. So the I think the Rapid City document stands as a testament to a sort of moderate approach to inculturation that allows these things at specific times for these very specific people. Okay, but then what about the, that those four women who are around the altar and they look like they're at least like 3/4 white, whose dad never had any, relation to uh tribal culture. Maybe her like grandfather or great grandfather did. Now, I could under certain circumstances say that at times it is a bit gaudy. At times the optics are bad, like quotes bad. It may look off, especially if you're ignorant of sort of the complex history to all of this. But I also need more details to actually make a judgment. For example, is the woman that I'm pointing at and accusing of something, is she an active member of the tribal nation? Was she appointed by the tribe? All of these things matter. It's not so much her skin color as such. As we have stated, that the blood percentages is a very convoluted, excuse the pun, it's a very convoluted thing. Reclaiming culture is a messy project, and most people want to like cherry pick or even like make up wholesale fabrications to incorporate this sort of fantasy notion of the past that they envisioned returning to. The pan-Indian movement, especially when considered from the liberal perspective, I think really failed to appreciate the diverse array of the cultures of the various Indian people. You even get the silly notion of this like cross-continental indigenous identity, which is certainly alien to the truly indigenous folk. For example, the Mexicans absolutely hated and feared the Comanches way more than they hated and feared white Europeans. In fact, in fact, the Mexicans invited white Europeans onto Mexican land to put a buffer between them and Comanchera. If you look at what the state of Texas is today, it's perfectly sandwiched between Mexico and what was Comanchera, because the Mexicans wanted this nice little buffer of whites to take the brunt of the Comanches, and this is where Texas comes from. Not to mention the Apache and the Cheyenne and the others that despised the Comanche as the Mexicans did. So despite the sort of liberal, like noble savage narrative, some of the tribes were in fact utterly brutal and unremorseful towards opponents in ways that are like objectively, I think, barbaric. I admire the Comanches as a great warrior race. Like in the same way that I would like admire like the Spartans or the Vikings, right? I don't look at them as like these liberal, loving tree huggers. So while there is some cross pollination of culture per like religious aspects, for example, and especially as like whites start moving in and you start getting like the pressure cooker of the tribe starts getting puts them closer proximity to each other, you begin to see like real cultural cross pollination of religious aspects and things like that. Like the ghost dance was a very late to the scene. I think the ghost dance comes on the scene in the 1870s and it spreads across various different. I think it begins with the Navajo tribes. Might be wrong about that. I think the ghost dance began in the Navajo tribes, and then it just sort of spread. It went up into the Lakota tribes. You have Black Elk himself talking about the ghost dances when they first entered the Oglala tribe. So highly developed cultures down in Mexico were like completely unrelated to the more like primitive and unique religious worship that you would find in the North American tribes. So I think it's a valid criticism when we see like maybe you see like a well-meaning Native American group that's like got some Catholics and they want to like cherry pick these customs and traditions that they're trying to reclaim from their past. You have to look a little deeper into what they mean by that. And you'll often find that what they wanted to reclaim is something that like never existed. So the church, I think, is fair to be moderate and, at times put the brakes on some of these things. But when you see these folks online, well, before I go to the traditionalists, I'll pick on the liberals a little bit, right? When you see these folks like I like certain Celtic Christians, for example, right? The ones that you see that, Celtic Christian, what they mean by it, it's so bad as to be like laughable. I mean, honestly, I've read some where they take the hagiography of St. Bridget of Kildare, um, and they say things about St. Bridget that makes my stomach turn. I saw this one guy, a quote unquote priest, wearing these like unironic rainbow vestments, saying that he was the real Celtic priest and that it was all about the vibrations, man. And this guy was clearly like he wanted to apply his old LSD trips from the 60s, from the summer of 67 to this ancient expression of the Celtic faith in the most anachronistic way possible. So yeah, absolutely that's something to be criticized. But as well, the Protestants, especially you Anglo Catholics or you former Anglo Catholics that are now Catholic, y'all tend to be just as bad about this at times. The only difference is that you wear suits and ties that gives your anachronisms this veneer of authenticity. I mean, I love the ones that come along that say that they want to claim the Anglicans that say that they want to claim the pre-Norman English Christianity, and then you call them out on that, and they say, "Well, okay, well, actually, I want to go back to the Anglo-Romano Christianity." So you call them out on that, and eventually they're like trying to reclaim some pre-Gregorian mission Christianity that we have very little record on to begin with. What record we do have, it seems to be mostly Pelagian, of some Pelagian island. So yeah, go ahead, slap together some hodgepodge concoction of Pelagianism, and let's see how that goes for you. So absolutely, enculturation is messy business, and if you like sausage, stay out of the sausage factory, folks. That's all I can tell you about it. I mean, for all the optics look bad people out there, I'd love to see what your own enculturation formula looks like, especially, like where you can show it to me in church history, where how the church enculturated in the past. Let's see what your package comes with. Because if it's some like bulldozer approach where you just sort of pull out the bulldozer and obliterate the culture, then I don't think you've actually offered a solution. Because as we were learning, that doesn't always end well. If your evangelization project gets wrapped up in an efforts to what looks like or what is exploitation, then these people tend to send the faith packing along with you, when you leave. Now, if you, like me, want to see the hard work get done, like we did in places like Africa, which is its own unique blend of European and tribal expressions of the faith, then, when the colonial powers packed up in Africa, notice that when the colonial powers packed up in Africa and left, the faith has sustained there. And Africa is really an interesting a case study because it is more modern. It's a more modern context. We can see how the church did it. And I know that SSPX loves to claim like Lefebvre. They seem to have this idea that like Lefebvre single-handedly like brought, and look, Lefebvre did some great work in Africa. Don't get me wrong, but he was one person in a huge project. And part of what happened in Africa, it's really unique because you have this case where many, specifically in Africa, young men left their sort of tribal areas and they went looking for employment in the cities. And it was in the cities that they ran across the Catholic missionaries. And these young men just got like on fire for the faith in these cities. You have even like with the martyrs in Uganda, you have the situations what happened in like places like Nigeria. But anyways, these young men convert, and then a lot of them come back to their homelands, to their tribal places where they lived, and they end up themselves converting the entire like population of villages and things like that. And it's a unique, like, you can watch a mass take place in Africa and you can know where you are. Like, it's sort of it's the ordinary form, it's the structure of the ordinary form. You can see where you are, but it is a unique expression of the faith. And you Anglo out there, you Anglophones, try to come and tell them the place where the church is exploding and growing, that they're not actually Christians, right? That they're pagans. But seriously, I want to know how you would enculturate in such a way that everyone is happy. I, you know, I had a lot of people reach out to me over. I had a quick conversation with Eric Ibarra, who I believe disagrees with me on this, and he's asked me to discuss it with him on the channel here. So I'd love to kind of see what his recommendations are, as he's someone that I actually respect, even when I disagree with. And I think in the end, you either tell the Greeks, "Hey, put up with the Latin shaving, deal with it. It may look bad, it may scandalize you, but here's why it isn't harmful to the faithful." Or you tell the Latins to start growing them beards because we are one faith, and therefore that means that we are one homogenous cultural expression of the faith. And I've got a lot more that I would say about it, but it's going to take too long, and I'm coming up at an hour here now, anyways. So I think I'm going to leave it at that for today. I am going to come back around to this. There's so many different areas of this that I want to touch upon. Let's see. Cajun French was also forbidden in schools in the South Louisiana for a long while. Yeah, Father John, I see where you said you actually had to run, but if you catch this later, I still want to get you on so we can talk about some of that, because this, like, I love in this channel to bring up Catholic. Like, I had somebody tell me the other day, there was a really nice compliment. Somebody messaged me that my channel is sort of this like intersection of Catholicism and culture in a unique. I was a very nice compliment. I can't remember exactly how we said it, but I do very much love and appreciate the way that um, the Catholic Church interacts with culture. And so I want to have you back on to discuss, because a lot of Americans don't realize how unique Louisiana is, specifically New Orleans, and that Cajun culture, that Cajun Catholic culture, I think is one of the few places in America where we could say, at least at one time, there was a thoroughly Catholic culture in America. At least the predominant culture of a place and city. Bob's asked, how is the dog is if I could show you the dog right now, you guys would laugh. He's laid out right on the other side of this camera here, and he's actually been a little sick, guys. He's getting a little old, so I don't know if some people are weird about praying for animals, so I'm not going to necessarily ask you to pray for, but pray for my family, because we're very attached to this dog. So something were to happen to him. Anyways, guys, that's it for today. We're going to revisit this at another time. I hope this is a good launching point, a good starting point, a good place to begin some discussions with people. Again, I think the takeaway is if you're dealing with honest interlocutors and they really want to have a conversation about this, let's see what their enculturation plan looks like. And I'm always glad when Father John is in here because Father John's very knowledgeable about the as a member of the Society of Jesus himself. Look, I am 100% behind the. I know there's individual controversial Jesuits and how they went about things, but as a grand scheme and a grand project, I think the Jesuits got it right, man. I think they understood what it's going to take to get in and truly enculturate. So we're definitely going to be coming back around to some of the Jesuit topics and conversations as we move forward in having this conversation, because I think there's a reason why a lot of people dislike the Jesuits, and some of it comes down to this question of what does enculturation look like. So stay tuned in the future, guys. God bless you all. I will see you next time.
Honey, their coffee can't hold a candle to yours.
Instant Folgers taste good as fresh perked.
This is Earth, the year 2100. This is the headquarters of Space Patrol. And men from Earth, Mars, and Venus live and work there as guardians of peace.
In the nation's capital, President Johnson today welcomed British Prime Minister Douglas Hume.